Well, welcome again to my fledgling channel. As always, I encourage you to like, subscribe, sign up for the Patreon, mail me snacks, anything you can do. I'm making this, so what I'm going to talk about is what we might do to improve the condition of wild animals, to make it so that they suffer less and they flourish more. The immediate catalyst for this was an episode of Walden Pod that my friend Emerson Green recently did, where he argues that actually we shouldn't do anything to try to help wild animals because we'll just make things worse. I have written academic work advocating for intervening to help wild animals, and so I thought this would be a good hook, a good opportunity to talk about a little of what I've said and a little of what other people have said. So it's important when we talk about intervening to help. Hey, bud. Yeah. Apollo thinks that he's a wild animal. When we talk about helping wild animals, what we're talking about is like trying to improve the welfare of individuals, right? And this is a pretty radical idea. When people think about wild animals ordinarily, what they think of really are like environmental values. They want there to be wild animals. Oh, let's leave them alone. But wild animals often have it very rough. They get eaten by other animals. They suffer from exposure to the elements. They starve. They freeze. All sorts of stuff happens to them, right? It's a pretty rough life. And so what I and some other people, Jeff McMahan, Kevin Esvelt, I'm one of the more minor people on the pro-intervention side, but what we've advocated for is trying to do things to help the wild animals, and I'll talk about this in a minute. Trying to do things to improve their condition to make it so that they suffer less. And the thing is, there are trillions of sentient animals. Maybe, depending on if invertebrates are conscious, maybe quintillions of sentient wild animals. So wild animals have it pretty rough, and there are a huge number of them. So wild animal suffering could very well be like wildly, wildly important in the aggregate, right? So if there's something we can do to cut into it, that could be a really, really important thing. Yet it's not something that gets much attention, right? People talk about environmental stuff. They don't actually talk about intervening in nature to try to improve the condition of animals, even though that might be an incredibly good thing to do if it can be done in an effective way, and that's what we're going to be talking about. I'll note Emerson's video and a lot of discussions about this tend to focus on predation. They act like what we're going to do, the way to intervene in nature to help the wild animals is to somehow end predation through genetic engineering or something like that. I think it's a little unfortunate that that gets so much attention. That's a very flashy idea, but certainly that would not be like the first thing you would do. That would be like the last thing you would do after you had already learned how to do everything else to help wild animals. So it makes the idea sound more science fiction-y than it really is, because people talk about this really big thing. But again, we'll talk about exactly what we really could do. I'll also note, when people talk about wild animal suffering, there's this argument, look, if the suffering of wild animals matters, then the suffering of wild animals in the aggregate, if the suffering of animals matters, then the suffering of wild animals in the aggregate is hugely important. So if the suffering of animals matters, we should do something about it. And then there are two directions in which you might go. You might go the direction that I go and say, okay, so if there's something we can do to help wild animals, it's really important that we do it. There are other people who kind of scoff. They say, oh, this is a reductio of the idea that animals matter morally. And I think that this is what really is motivating Emerson to talk about this, is trying to respond to this anti-animal rights argument from these people. I'll talk a little bit about that at the very end. is this whole idea just absurd or whatever? I think the right solution is just we should intervene to help wild animals if we can. So there are philosophers who have said, look, even if we could intervene to make wild animals a lot better off, we shouldn't do that. And I think those arguments are very poor. I'll link in the description an explanation of why I think that they're a paper where I argue that they're very poor. That's not Emerson's argument. Emerson's argument is, yeah, look, if we could wave a magic wand and do away with all the things that cause wild animals to suffer, yeah, you should do it. But in practice, we're just going to mess things up. And he focuses on the case of trying to, this is something some people have talked about, trying to use gene editing. You do what's called gene drive. You genetically engineer some individuals and then you release them into the wild and they breed, and because of genetic things I won't be able to explain, they pass on their genes at a higher rate than they would naturally, and this means that you can spread genes throughout an entire population. By doing this, you could essentially genetically engineer populations of wild animals. And right now there are suggestions that we do this, say, to try to eliminate malaria. Genetically edit wild mosquitoes so that if they get malaria, they just die, or for whatever reason they can't pass it on or whatever. Okay. So some people have suggested, let's do gene drives to re-engineer predators and turn them into herbivores, or maybe sterilize the predators and have them slowly die out, and we'll keep some in sanctuaries where we feed them cultured lab meat or something like that. Like I said, first, and Emerson says, look, you couldn't do this, even if we suppose you have the technology to do the genetic editing, you couldn't do this and expect everything else to remain in place. Certainly that's true. He says it might even cause the whole system to collapse into non-existence. It might destroy the whole ecosystem if you did this. I don't think that that's true. I mean, there are natural ecosystems that don't have predators. Ecosystems on islands and things, certain islands. There are areas where humans have eliminated large predators and things like that, and the ecosystem doesn't collapse into non-existence. So I don't think there's any possibility of that. But it is true, if you just eliminated all the predators, then you're going to have an explosion of the prey animals. The plants that are around for them to eat and stuff, those are going to stay constant. So you're going to have increased resource competition, maybe a lot of starvation. Maybe that would be worse than predation. It's hard to say. I mean, predation, you think about the badness of being eaten, and that is bad. Predation is also a constant source of stress for animals, I think, which kind of makes sense if there were people going around, if there were cannibals around you all the time threatening to eat you. You'd be pretty stressed out. Animals that live in island ecosystems where there aren't predators exhibit something called island tameness, where they seem a lot more chill all the time. So, I mean, predation is a constant bad thing, but so is starving to death and having to fight for resources and all this sort of stuff. So, just eliminating predators and not doing anything else, it's pretty plausible that that would make things worse. But there are two things to say about this. First of all, as I said, there are other things you want to do first before you start trying to mess around with predation. Things that actually we can do right now, and that plausibly would make things better. Maybe more research is needed or something. But so, for instance, I'll link in the description Kevin Esvelt, who's an evolutionary biologist at MIT. I think he helped invent gene drives, so he knows a lot about this stuff. He has advocated for using gene drives to eliminate certain parasites that cause a lot of pain to wild animals. There's this parasite called the New World screwworm that it digs into your flesh, and it's very painful. Apparently, people who have it like it's impossible to even examine the wound before giving them some sort of anesthesia or something because it's so painful. Humans have eliminated these from North America because we don't want them infecting livestock herds. For geography, I think, or something, it's harder to eliminate them from South America, but we could do it, he thinks, with gene drives by releasing sterile individuals, cause them ultimately to die out. And then vast numbers of wild animals, I don't know, tens of millions or whatever, would be spared having this really horrific parasite infecting them. And he says, look, it doesn't look like eliminating them from North America has caused any kind of ecological damage or anything. So one thing at least we could look into that we can do right now is eliminating certain natural parasites. Another thing, there are organizations like Animal Ethics and the Wild Animal Initiative that actually do work like investigating these things, trying to research them. Another thing that they've looked into is already we try to vaccinate certain wild animal populations through oral bait to try to, say, eliminate rabies so that it won't be spread to humans. Maybe we could try to eliminate certain diseases among wild animals through vaccination. It's hard to know, whether these things are good on balance, but, intuitively, some horrific parasite that causes you immense pain, probably be better not to have that. Maybe we need more research, but there are promising things that we might do in the near term. Now, Emerson does say near the end of the video, maybe there are minor things that we could do. I don't know if he's thinking that these are minor things or not. I don't know. Was vaccinating people against polio like a minor public health intervention? I wouldn't think so. But, I wouldn't say that these are minor. I would say that these are pretty substantial things that we could do. And that are worth doing if it looks like, as, for instance, Kevin Esvelt thinks, if it looks like we could do them without any countervailing bad effects. Now, the other thing to say about actually trying to eliminate predation, everybody who has advocated for this, of course, realizes if you eliminate the predators, then the prey population is going to explode, and that's going to have other effects on the ecosystem and other effects for members of that species. Nobody thinks, oh, we can eliminate the predators and just leave everything else as it is. So what people have discussed as well, somehow you need to counteract the population of prey animals, right? Somehow you need to get them to reproduce less. Maybe you genetically engineer them at the same time so that they're less fertile, or maybe you give them oral contraceptives or something like this. That mirrors basically what human beings have done, right? It used to be you'd have a whole mess of kids and then a bunch of them would die. Now your kids don't all die anymore. So why aren't we just awashing kids? Well, people artificially control their fertility, right? Maybe we could do that for wild animals. Now, that would be incredibly difficult to do, right? Getting everything just right, getting just the right number of animals. And it may well be that would require knowledge that we don't have right now and technology that we don't have right now. In fact, I think both those things are true. So what this would suggest, in my view, though, is that what we need is a lot more research. Maybe the end of the research it will turn out that there's just no way to do this ever. Maybe, I don't know. And if so, I think it will still have been worth doing the research, probably because we'll learn other things that are useful, and because, it's such an important issue that it's worth taking the shot, right? Let's look into trying to understand welfare biology, this field that attempts to understand what's good and bad for individual wild animals, welfare biology. That's a nascent field, and not a lot of research has been done in it. I don't think we have any idea how advanced it might be in 100 years, in 200 years. let's look into other technologies that would be needed to effectively administer this kind of program. Maybe ultimately you would need, I don't know, AI and drones and all sorts of surveillance, who knows, right? Maybe you would need things that right now we can barely comprehend. I mean, if you think about what I'm doing right now, uploading a YouTube video, people 200 years ago could not even begin to grasp how that works. Even people, in the 1950s would not be able to grasp how that works. They would think maybe there's some facility with a bunch of film and somehow you can get that broadcast to your computer, or so I don't think we know exactly how we would do that. I don't think we know whether it's ultimately possible, but I think there are reasons to suppose that it might be ultimately possible given enough technological development, and I think that it's worth trying to get people to look into it. If eliminating predation ultimately turns out to be impossible, we should look into things like welfare biology anyway, because it will be useful in some of the more low-level, more feasible things that we can do to help wild animals. So really what we need for the wild animal suffering stuff is like people going into the life sciences and, learning about genetic engineering, learning about welfare biology. And again, particularly welfare biology, you maybe could become like a leading figure in if you're good enough at it, since it's such a small field. Emerson gives this quote from Aldo Leopold, where he says, a lot of humans approach nature with this conqueror mentality, and of course the problem is always that the conqueror does not really realize how the community works and how what things are really important, what things really make things go. And I guess the suggestion is, if we try to start messing around in nature in drastic ways, then we're exhibiting this conqueror mentality. I think that's kind of a good thing to keep in mind. Our own ignorance, our remaining humble, thinking, the presumption should be maybe against us interfering. I mean, we interfere in nature all the time, of course, already, and but there are limits to that, right? Libertarians sometimes use very similar arguments for absolute unregulated free market economics. The government can never have the information needed to regulate the economy, and both Emerson and I reject those arguments. So what we need to do is just really try to investigate the relevant fields, try to build them up, try to see if we really can learn what we need to learn to effectively intervene in nature, do it in small scale ways and see what happens. And I think hopefully ultimately, there will be productive things for us to do. And I think it's important. I mean, you might think, well, wait a minute, if so much of this is just off in the future, why are we even talking about it now? But I think it's important that we talk about it because, first of all this research that needs to be done, we need to do it sooner or later, I say, right? Second of all, it's not obvious that over time things are trending in the direction of caring about the welfare of individual wild animals. There is this trend in the direction of caring about the environment, about ecosystems, about biodiversity. But an ecosystem can be very healthy from an ecological perspective while containing an immense amount of suffering, right? Right now, as ecosystems are constituted, when the prey animal gets eaten alive, oh, that's good, But what people are caring about is not actually how well off the individual wild animals are. And so you could imagine a future where 200 years from now we have the technology to do these things, but people have these non-interventionist environmentalist values that cause them not to do it. And the issue is, because this issue is so potentially important, trillions, maybe quintillions of individuals, any delay in our effectively intervening could be really, really bad, in my view. If we put off the research, if we get the technologies but we don't intervene, either of those things could be really, really bad, because even a little delay will allow a lot of suffering. And if it's an indefinite delay, if we never do it, then that would be really, really bad in the aggregate, it seems to me. So roughly, in terms of the feasibility stuff, there's a lot of stuff we can do that is not minor, but still is feasible, more feasible than ending predation. And when it comes to predation, there are other things you could do to try to keep the ecosystem's balance. Those are hard to do. Maybe that just means we require, and in fact I think that does mean, in order to try that, we need more technology, more research, a greater understanding of ecology. Maybe we'll never get to the point where we can productively intervene, but I think we might. To close, to turn back to this question about, is this just totally absurd, you just shouldn't even take it seriously? Is this a reductio of the view that animals matter? I don't think so. I mean, I think it's obvious that animals matter. I think it's obvious that Apollo matters, and Apollo was a stray cat when I got him. If he had remained a stray cat and never become a domestic cat, he would have been a wild animal, I guess. He still would have mattered. It would have been bad if something bad happened to him. So it's obvious that wild animals matter. And when it comes to this scoffing reaction people have at the idea of helping wild animals, I think we can error theorize that. We can explain why they have that reaction, even though it's not right. It's weird. People scoff at weird ideas. They've always scoffed at weird ideas, even if they turn out to be good ideas. People have what's called status quo bias. Anything that involves drastic changes to things people don't like. There's all kinds of psychological literature on this. People have what's called scope insensitivity. They're not sensitive to how like your intuitions don't respond to increases in very large numbers, right? Intuitively, you can't represent the difference between how bad it is for 10,000 animals to die versus 1 billion animals dying. You have to think that through reflectively. And so the fact that there are trillions of wild animals, maybe quadrillions or quintillions suffering, people's intuitions just don't register that at all. So the people who think that this is a reductio of the position because it's just absurd, we can explain why they think it's absurd in ways that don't appeal to it actually being a bad idea. And when we think through reflectively these ideas, I think it's pretty obvious that, yeah, if there are things we can do productively to help wild animals, of course we should do them. And I think it's at least plausible enough that there are things we can do productively to help wild animals that we should be putting a lot of effort into figuring out whether that's true and what they are, because it's a really important issue. So that's what I have to say about